Pakistan had a nuclear arsenal and a terrorism problem. Right now, as of April 2026, it has the world's most powerful men sitting at its table. With under 90 minutes left before Donald Trump's self-declared deadline to destroy Iran's civilization, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Field Marshal Asim Munir made the call that stopped the clock. Trump cited conversations with Sharif and Munir directly, saying they had requested that I hold off the destructive force being sent tonight to Iran, before announcing a 2-week ceasefire on Truth Social. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi credited them just as publicly. The Islamabad talks, the first direct, high-level, in-person engagement between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, lasted 21 hours, with a 300-member U.S. delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance and a 70-member Iranian team facing each other across a table in Islamabad. No other capital on earth could have put them in that room. Just 12 months before those talks, India launched Operation Sindoor, calibrated military strikes on terror infrastructure deep inside Pakistan, following the April 22, 2025 Pahalgam attack that killed 26 civilians. Pakistan was the accused. Pakistan was isolated. In New Delhi, the explicit strategic goal was to further isolate Islamabad internationally, portraying it as a state that shelters and supports terrorist groups, a narrative built over years of sustained diplomatic effort. It almost worked. Then Washington spoke, and the entire chessboard flipped. What you are about to understand is not a diplomatic accident. It's a calculated pivot by a nuclear state that turned its greatest liabilities into its most powerful leverage, and in doing so, repositioned itself at the center of a war it had no formal stake in. How did Pakistan get here? And what does it mean that the world's most dangerous flashpoints now run through Islamabad? To understand how Pakistan arrived at the Islamabad talks, you have to understand what Pakistan was supposed to be by now. For decades, Washington's relationship with Islamabad followed a brutal cycle: use, reward, abandon, punish. Pakistan hosted American bases and supply lines during the 1980s Afghan jihad against the Soviet Union, receiving billions in military aid. When the Cold War ended, the United States imposed sanctions and walked away. After September 11, 2001, Islamabad became indispensable again. Frontline partner, intelligence sharer, logistics corridor for 2 decades of war in Afghanistan. Then came the withdrawal, the mistrust, the aid freezes, and the accusations. By the time Trump's first term ended, Pakistan was being described in Washington circles less as a partner and more as a threat. In December 2024, then Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner formally described Pakistan as an emerging threat to the United States. That was the baseline. The nuclear dimension made everything worse. Pakistan tested its first atomic device on May 28, 1998, a direct response to India's test earlier that month, and immediately became a pariah in the eyes of non-proliferation advocates worldwide. It has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It does not recognize Israel. Its soil hosted Osama bin Laden for years, in a garrison town less than 100 kilometers from Islamabad. By 2023, the Congressional Research Service described Pakistan as a country in a full poly-crisis: political instability, economic collapse, active terrorist insurgencies, and reduced diplomatic influence occurring simultaneously. These were not the credentials of a peacemaker. They were the credentials of a problem state. Yet embedded in every one of those liabilities was a structural asset that nobody in Washington had fully priced. Pakistan shares a 909-kilometer border with Iran. It has deep Sunni institutional ties to Saudi Arabia, ties stretching back to the 1970s, when Pakistani troops first stationed on Saudi soil and Riyadh reportedly helped finance Islamabad's nuclear program. It maintains an all-weather strategic partnership with China, anchored in the multi-billion-dollar China-Pakistan economic corridor. And crucially, it had just survived a nuclear standoff with India, in full view of Donald Trump, who had decided, regardless of the military facts on the ground, that he had personally saved the world. That decision changed everything. Over 80% of Pakistan's energy imports transit the Strait of Hormuz. When Iran shut that waterway in February 2026, Pakistan did not have the luxury of watching from a distance. Islamabad had enormous skin in this game, more than any country east of Iran, and that urgency gave its diplomacy a credibility that purely self-interested great powers could not replicate. The question was never whether Pakistan had the connections. The question was whether it had the nerve to use them, and whether the moment would ever be large enough to make the world notice. The nerve arrived on March 22, 2026. That was the day Field Marshal Asim Munir picked up the phone and called Donald Trump directly, not through intermediaries, not through back channels, but as an equal. Trump had already announced a 5-day pause on strikes targeting Iranian energy infrastructure by then, signaling he was open to a diplomatic exit. Munir read that signal and moved. On March 23rd, Pakistan formally offered to host talks, and Sharif echoed the offer publicly on X, tagging Trump, Araqchi, and Witkoff simultaneously. It was a public commitment before either side had agreed, a calculated gamble that made backing down politically costly for Washington and Tehran alike. The groundwork behind that gamble had been laid in layers, each one placed with precision. In September 2025, Pakistan acknowledged Trump's role in ending the India-Pakistan conflict and nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. Analysts noted plainly that the move was designed to lock in Trump's goodwill before the Iran crisis escalated further. It worked. Trump began referring to Asim Munir as his favorite field marshal. That phrase, casual, personal, transactional, was worth more to Pakistan than any formal security guarantee. It meant that when Islamabad called, Washington answered. On the Iranian side, the architecture was different but equally deliberate. Pakistan's ties with Iran allowed its shipments to continue transiting the Strait of Hormuz even as the waterway tightened for everyone else. Islamabad had never joined the anti-Iranian coalition forming around Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. It condemned Israeli strikes. It hosted Shia clerics and managed sectarian pressures internally. Iran's ambassador in Islamabad stated plainly that Tehran would do talks in Pakistan and nowhere else, because we trust Pakistan. That sentence, delivered by a government that had refused direct contact with Washington since 1979, was the most consequential endorsement in the entire crisis. Then came the escalation that forced everyone's hand. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States launched an air war against Iran, killing its supreme leader and many other officials. Iran responded with missile and drone strikes across the region and closed the Strait of Hormuz, through which 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supplies had been flowing. On March 6th, Trump wrote that there would be no deal with Iran except its unconditional surrender. The gap between the two sides was not negotiable by normal diplomatic standards. It required a mediator both sides trusted enough to carry messages that neither could publicly send. Pakistan ran that channel for weeks. On March 25th, Pakistani officials delivered a 15-point proposal from the United States to Iran, detailing a ceasefire plan covering an end to Iran's nuclear program, limits on its missiles, reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, restrictions on Iranian support for armed groups, and sanctions relief. Iran rejected it. Pakistan absorbed the rejection and kept moving. On March 31st, Pakistan put forward its own 5-point initiative, calling for an immediate end to all hostilities and allowance of humanitarian aid. Neither superpower had asked for it. Islamabad wrote it anyway, and both sides read it. The deadline arrived on April 7, 2026. Trump threatened that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back, if Iran did not reach an agreement with the United States. That was not rhetoric. U.S. strike packages were reportedly in the air. With under 90 minutes remaining, Sharif posted publicly on social media, tagging Trump, tagging Araqchi, tagging Witkoff, calling on Iran to reopen the strait for 2 weeks and calling on all parties to observe an immediate ceasefire. Trump publicly credited Sharif and Munir by name in his Truth Social ceasefire announcement, saying they had requested that I hold off the destructive force being sent tonight to Iran. Araqchi confirmed the ceasefire and credited Pakistan's brotherly intervention. Two nuclear-armed adversaries, separated by 4 decades of silence, had just been walked back from the edge by a third. The Islamabad talks that followed on April 11th and 12th lasted 21 hours across 3 rounds, the first indirect, the second and third direct, making them the first in-person high-level engagement between Washington and Tehran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. More than 10,000 police and paramilitary personnel locked down the Pakistani capital. The Serena Hotel was emptied of its guests and requisitioned for the delegations. The U.S. side was led by Vice President J.D. Vance, alongside Special Envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iran sent Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The talks ended without a final agreement. The Strait of Hormuz and Iran's nuclear program remained unresolved, but the fact of the meeting itself had already rewritten the rules of what was possible, and the channel through which any future deal must pass now runs directly through Islamabad. The country that just hosted the most consequential diplomatic talks since the Cold War does not recognize the State of Israel. That detail sits at the center of everything, and almost nobody is discussing what it actually means. Start with the historical parallel, because this has happened before. In 1971, Henry Kissinger used Pakistan as a secret back-channel to open relations between the United States and China, a country Washington had refused to formally acknowledge for over 2 decades. The logic then was identical to the logic now. You use the state that both sides will speak to, regardless of your own preferences about that state's character. Pakistan's role was not incidental to that diplomatic breakthrough. It was structurally necessary. Analysts have noted that Pakistan's value as a mediator lies in the rare credibility it holds with both sides simultaneously, a quality that great powers, by definition, cannot possess. The 1971 parallel is not decorative. It is a precise blueprint, and Islamabad has read it. Now the silent beneficiary, the actor whose position has strengthened through this crisis in ways that current coverage is almost entirely ignoring. That actor is Field Marshal Asim Munir, and more specifically, Pakistan's military establishment as an institution. Consider what has occurred. 12 months ago, Munir's government was managing a domestic political crisis involving the imprisonment of former Prime Minister Imran Khan, accusations of election manipulation, and an economy requiring International Monetary Fund intervention to avoid sovereign default. Pakistan faced severe governance challenges, while insurgent groups including the Balochistan Liberation Army and Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan continued to challenge state authority. The military's domestic legitimacy was under sustained pressure. Then Operation Sindoor gave Munir a stage. Then the Iran crisis gave him a global one. Trump called him his favorite field marshal and acknowledged his role personally in a ceasefire announcement heard by every government on earth. The IMF does not negotiate with isolated pariah states. Foreign investors do not enter economies run by internationally sanctioned military establishments. Every photograph of Munir beside Vance, every Truth Social post crediting Islamabad, converts directly into domestic political insulation and external financial credibility. The peacemaker role is not separate from Pakistan's internal power struggle. It is the primary instrument of it. And here is the unnamed risk, the one that 21 hours of Islamabad talks did not resolve and that no major outlet has yet quantified with adequate precision. In September 2025, Pakistan signed the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement with Saudi Arabia, a mutual defense pact formalized after Israeli strikes on Doha heightened Gulf security concerns. That agreement implicitly functions as a diplomatic signal to Washington, but it carries a structural military commitment that becomes activated the moment Saudi Arabia decides to escalate against Iran. Pakistan is currently the mediator between a country it has a defense pact with, Saudi Arabia, and a country whose foreign minister just said Iran will only negotiate in Islamabad because it trusts Pakistan. As the conflict continued, Pakistan simultaneously sent fighter jets to Saudi Arabia under the terms of that September 2025 pact, even as negotiations with Iran were ongoing in Islamabad. Both sides know this. Neither has yet forced Islamabad to choose. But the ceasefire is fragile. The naval blockade remains in place, and Iran has described the U.S. blockade as unlawful and criminal, a stance that makes any lasting framework deal structurally dependent on concessions that Washington has not yet offered. If the ceasefire collapses and Saudi Arabia invokes the SMDA, Pakistan does not get to remain a neutral arbiter. It becomes a combatant against the country whose trust made it indispensable. The entire architecture of Islamabad's diplomatic rise rests on a contradiction it has not resolved. It has managed that contradiction brilliantly so far. But management is not a resolution. And the Strait of Hormuz, still partially closed, still contested, still the artery through which over 80% of Pakistan's own energy imports must flow, means the cost of that contradiction failing is not abstract. It lands directly on Pakistani fuel prices, Pakistani supply chains, and the Pakistani civilian population that has been told its military just saved the world.